The moment his radio went dead was the moment he realized he had just ordered the wrong woman to leave. Officer Daniel Brooks stood firm in the narrow corridor of the restricted federal floor, his hand raised just enough to block her path as the elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft metallic echo. The air felt colder here, sharper, like every breath carried the weight of authority that most people never questioned. Ava Carter did not step back. She stood still, her posture calm, her eyes steady, not challenging him, but not yielding either. Around them, a few staff members slowed their pace, pretending to check their phones while quietly watching the tension unfold. Daniel's jaw tightened as he looked her up and down, taking in her simple clothing, the absence of any visible clearance badge, and making a decision he had made too many times before. "You cannot be here," he said, his voice firm and edged with something colder than procedure. "This floor is restricted." Ava's gaze did not shift. She did not reach for her bag, did not argue, did not even sigh. For a brief second, the silence between them stretched longer than it should have, like a moment waiting to break. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Daniel exhaled sharply, clearly irritated by her composure. "People like you always think the rules do not apply," he added, his tone dropping lower, more personal now, as if the hallway itself gave him permission to say what he wanted. Ava tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet observation, as if she were measuring something unseen. "Are you sure about that, officer?" she asked softly, her voice controlled, almost gentle, yet carrying a weight that did not match the situation. Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he reached toward his radio, the familiar device clipped to his shoulder, the symbol of his connection to the system that backed him. "I am very sure," he replied, pressing the button without breaking eye contact. "Dispatch. I have an unauthorized individual on the restricted level, preparing to escort her out." The words came out smooth, practiced, confident, but the response never came. A faint crackle, then nothing. Daniel frowned, pressing the button. Again, harder this time. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Silence. Not the usual delay, not static, not interference. Just silence, complete and absolute. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Ava's eyes moved briefly to the radio, then back to him. And there was something there now, something different, something that made the air feel heavier than before. Down the corridor, a security camera made a quiet mechanical adjustment, its lens turning with slow precision until it faced directly toward them. One of the staff members who had been pretending not to watch suddenly froze, his hand lowering from his ear as if the voice he had been listening to had just disappeared. Daniel swallowed, his confidence flickering for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "Equipment glitches happen," he muttered, more to himself than to her. But his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Ava did not move. She did not need to, because somewhere beyond that hallway, beyond the walls he thought he controlled, something had already begun to shift, and he had not yet realized that the system he trusted had just stopped listening to him. Daniel Brooks pressed the radio button again, slower this time, as if changing the pressure of his thumb might somehow bring the system back to life. But the channel remained open and empty, a hollow line with no voice on the other end, no acknowledgement, no static chatter from dispatch, just a quiet that did not belong in a building that never truly slept. And for a moment, he felt something unfamiliar crawl up the back of his neck, something he quickly tried to bury under routine and authority. Because systems did not just go silent without a reason, and he had spent years trusting that the reason would always be simple, always explainable, always under control, yet nothing about this felt simple, and nothing about the woman standing in front of him felt ordinary either. Ava Carter shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply existing in that space with a kind of stillness that seemed to absorb the tension instead of reacting to it. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, almost patient, as if she had seen this moment unfold before in a dozen different ways. "You should try again, officer," she said, her eyes steady on. Because sometimes the first call does not go through. Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, annoyed by the suggestion, by the tone, by the implication that he needed guidance. I know how to use my equipment, he replied, sharper now, pressing the button a third time. Dispatch respond. This is Officer Brooks requesting backup on a restricted level. But the result was the same, an open channel with nothing behind it, like speaking into a void that refused to answer. And this time, the silence lingered longer, stretching out just enough to make the people watching feel it too. One of the employees down the hall lowered his phone completely now, no longer pretending to ignore what was happening, while another slowly stepped back toward side office, her expression tightening with quiet concern. Daniel noticed the movement in his peripheral vision, and it only irritated him more. Because attention meant witnesses, and witnesses meant reports, and reports meant questions. And questions were the one thing he did not want right now. He lowered his hand from the radio and looked at Ava again. Really looked this time, not just at her clothes or her presence, but at the way she held herself, the way she did not fidget or glance around or to try to justify her position. It was the kind of composure he had seen before, but never in someone he had already decided did not belong. You think this is funny, he said, his voice dropping, stepping closer to close the distance between them, trying to reassert the control he felt slipping in ways he could not explain. Ava did not step back, did not raise her voice. She simply met him where he stood, her expression unchanged. I think you are about to understand something important, she replied, and there was no threat in her words, no anger, just a quiet certainty that made his chest tighten without his permission. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head as he reached out, his hand moving toward her arm in a gesture meant to guide, to direct, to enforce the boundary he believed he still owned. You are leaving now, he said, his fingers brushing against her sleeve for the briefest second, and that was when everything changed. The overhead lights flickered once, not enough to draw alarm, but enough to be noticed, a subtle shift that rippled through the corridor like a breath being held. The security camera that had turned toward them earlier adjusted again, this time locking its focus with deliberate precision, and somewhere deeper in the building a low tone sounded, soft but unmistakable, like a system waking up. Daniel froze for just a fraction of a second, his hand still near her arm, his instincts telling him that something had just crossed a line he could not see. And then, from the small speaker on his radio, not from dispatch, but from a channel he had never heard before, a voice began to form, not loud, not urgent, but controlled, measured, and impossible to ignore. And in that instant, Daniel Brooks realized that the silence had not been a malfunction. It had been a decision. The voice that emerged from the radio was not rushed, not distorted, and not uncertain. It carried a calm authority that did not ask for attention, but commanded it. Officer Daniel Brooks, remove your hand and step back immediately. For a moment, Daniel did not move, his mind trying to process what he was hearing, because this was not dispatch. This was not any supervisor he recognized. And yet there was something in the tone that cut through his instinct to challenge it. Something precise, controlled, and final. He slowly withdrew his hand from Ava Carter's sleeve, his fingers curling slightly, as if unsure what to do, without the certainty he had been holding on to just seconds before. Who is this? He demanded, his voice firmer than he felt. Identifying yourself on this channel. There was a brief pause, not the kind of pause that comes from confusion, but the kind that feels deliberate, as if the silence itself was part of the response. Then the voice returned, you are operating outside your authority. Officer, stand down. Daniel's jaw tightened, the words hitting him harder than he expected, because authority had always been the ground he stood on, the thing that made him certain, the thing that justified every decision he made in moments like this. And now that ground felt unstable, shifting beneath him in ways he could not control. He glanced around the corridor, noticing that the employees who had been watching were no longer pretending to be busy, their attention fully locked onto the unfolding moment. One man, near the far wall, subtly adjusted his stance, his posture straightening as if he had just received instructions of his own. Daniel looked back at Ava, searching her face for any sign of surprise, any reaction that would confirm she was as caught off guard as he was. But there was none. She stood exactly as she had before, calm, composed, almost as if this was expected, almost as if this was inevitable. "What is this?" he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but edged with something that had not been there before. Uncertainty. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. "You said this floor is restricted," she replied, her tone even, "and you were right." Daniel frowned, the answer not satisfying him, not giving him the clarity he needed, because it felt like only part of something larger, something he was not being allowed to see yet. The overhead lights flickered again, this time holding for a fraction longer before stabilizing, and the low tone from deeper within the building returned. Slightly louder now, like a system confirming a sequence that had already begun. Daniel's radio crackled once more, the same voice returning. "Officer Brooks, you are no longer in control of this situation. Repeat, you are to disengage immediately." Daniel felt a flash of irritation rise up, instinctively pushing back against the idea of losing control, against the idea that someone else had stepped into his space and rewritten the rules without warning. "I have a right to know what is going on here," he said, his voice firm again, trying to reclaim the authority that had always defined him. "I am responsible for security on this level." The response came without hesitation. "No, officer, you are responsible for following orders, and at this moment you're failing to do so." The words landed with a weight that made the corridor feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the situation. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped because something else had caught his attention. The elevator at the end of the hall, the one that required clearance beyond his level, had just activated, the soft hum of its movement breaking through the tension like a signal that something more was about to arrive. The digital panel above the doors lit up, numbers descending one level at a time, steady, deliberate, controlled. And for the first time since this began, Daniel felt a shift he could not ignore. Not just uncertainty, but the beginning of realization. Ava's eyes moved briefly toward the elevator, then back to him, and in that brief glance there was something new, not superiority, not arrogance, but certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is about to happen next. "You asked who was on the other end of that radio," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear. "You're about to find out." The elevator reached the floor with a soft chime, the doors still closed, holding whatever answer waited behind them. And Daniel Brooks stood there, caught between the authority he thought he had and the truth that was now moving steadily toward him. The elevator doors remained closed for a brief moment that felt longer than it should have, the soft hum of the system settling into a low silence that pressed against the walls. And Daniel Brooks found himself staring at the scene between the doors, as if he could force them open with expectation alone, his grip tightening slightly around the radio that no longer felt like a tool of control, but something uncertain, something unreliable. Then, with a quiet mechanical release, the doors slid apart, smooth and precise, revealing two figures standing inside, both dressed in dark suits that carried no visible insignia, yet somehow signaled more authority than any uniform Daniel had ever worn. Their posture was composed, their expressions neutral, and the way they stepped forward was not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate, as if every movement had already been decided before they arrived. The man in front, tall with a calm, unreadable face, made eye contact with Daniel first, not Ava, and in that look there was no curiosity, no hesitation, only recognition. "Officer Brooks," he said evenly, his voice matching the one that had come through the radio. And that alone was enough to send a quiet shock through Daniel's chest, because now the voice had a face, and that face did not belong to anyone in his chain of command. Daniel straightened instinctively, his training kicking in even as his thoughts struggled to keep up. "Identifying yourself," he replied, his tone firm but no longer as steady as before. The man stepped fully out of the elevator, stopping at a distance that was close enough to command the space but far enough to avoid escalation. "Special Agent Marcus Hale, Internal Affairs Division," he said, each word clear, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The second agent remained slightly behind him, scanning the corridor with quiet awareness. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward Ava, then back to Marcus Hale, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he understood about the situation. Internal Affairs did not just appear without cause. They did not override. communication channels, and they certainly did not respond to a routine removal on a restricted floor. There has to be some kind of mistake, Daniel said, the words coming out faster now, a trace of urgency slipping through. I was following protocol, unauthorized individual, restricted access. That is my responsibility. Marcus Hale listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. And when Daniel finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but controlled, as if the response had already been prepared long before this moment. Your responsibility was to assess, not assume, Hale replied, his voice calm but firm, and you failed to do that. Daniel felt the words land harder than any direct accusation, because they cut straight through the justification he had been holding on to. He shifted his stance slightly, tried to regain footing, tried to find something solid in a situation that kept moving beyond his reach. I asked her to leave, he said, gesturing slightly toward Ava. Without fully turning away from Hale, she did not comply. Hale's gaze did not follow the gesture. It remained on Daniel, because she was not required to comply, he said, and that was the moment the balance shifted completely. Daniel's brow furrowed, confusion now fully visible. What are you talking about? This floor is restricted. Hale nodded once, a small, controlled motion. It is, he agreed, and that restriction does not apply to her. The words settled into the corridor with a quiet finality. And for a second, Daniel simply stared, as if waiting for the explanation that would make everything make sense again. But it did not come. Not yet. Instead, Hale reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with a deliberate calm that made every movement feel significant. Daniel's instincts tensed anyway, his body reacting before his mind could fully process. But Hale only removed a thin folder, dark and unmarked, holding it at his side. Without opening it, you made a call for backup, Hale continued, and what you received was not a malfunction. It was an override. Daniel's eyes shifted again, this time toward Ava, and for the first time since this began, he truly looked at her not as someone out of place, but as someone at the center of everything unfolding. Ava did not move, did not speak. But there was something in the stillness of her presence that now carried a different weight, something undeniable, something that made the air feel heavier with every passing second. Hale took one small step forward, just enough to close the distance. Officer Brooks, he said, his voice steady, you need to understand that the situation you believed you were controlling never belonged to you. And behind him, the elevator doors remained open, waiting, as if whatever came next had already been set in motion long before Daniel ever reached for his radio. Daniel Brooks felt the weight of Marcus Hale's words settle into the space around him. Not loud, not aggressive, but heavy in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, he searched for something to hold on to, some version of procedure or protocol that could restore the balance he had lost. But every instinct that had guided him before seemed to fall short here. Because nothing about this situation followed the patterns he trusted. You are saying she has clearance, Daniel said, his voice slower now, more careful, as if choosing each word might somehow give him back control. Hale did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Ava Carter for the first time since stepping out of the elevator. And in that glance, there was acknowledgement, not surprise, not deference, but recognition of authority that ran deeper than titles spoken out loud. Ava met his look with the same calm she had held from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. Then, Hale turned his attention back to Daniel. Clearance is the wrong word, he said, and that single sentence created a pause that stretched across the corridor because it did not clarify anything. It only deepened the uncertainty. Daniel frowned, trying to follow. If not clearance, then what? He asked, the question sharper than he intended. And for the first time since this began, Hale allowed a slight shift in his expression, not emotion, but something closer to finality. Access at this level is not granted to her. Hale said, it is defined by her. The words landed with a quiet force that changed everything. Daniel blinked once, then again, as if the meaning had not fully registered, but it just did not fit into anything he understood. That does not make sense, he said, shaking his head slightly, because in his world authority came from rank, from assignment, from visible structure, not from something that existed beyond. Hale did not argue. He simply stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear line between Daniel and Ava, and in doing so shifted the focus entirely. "You've been looking at this situation from the wrong direction," Hale said, his voice even. "You saw someone you believed did not belong, and you acted on that belief without verification." Daniel's jaw tightened because he knew that part was true, but admitting it felt like losing ground. He was not ready to surrender. She had no visible identification. He responded, his tone defensive now. "That is standard procedure." Hale nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its conclusion. "And what you did not consider," he continued, "is that not all authority is carried in a way you can see." The corridor fell into a deeper silence, the kind that made every small movement feel amplified. Somewhere behind them a door clicked shut softly, and the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. Daniel's eyes shifted back to Ava again, and this time he noticed details he had overlooked before, the way she stood without tension, the way her gaze did not search for approval or permission, the way she had never once tried to explain herself, as if explanation had never been necessary. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, the question no longer carrying accusation but something closer to need. Ava held his gaze, and for a moment it seemed like she might answer directly, but instead she took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not hesitant, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, and in that movement the entire corridor seemed to adjust around her. "You have been asking the wrong question," she said quietly, her voice steady. "You should be asking why the system stopped responding to you." Daniel felt a chill move through him at those words, because deep down he already knew the answer was not technical, not a glitch, not a failure. It was intentional, and intention meant control, and control meant someone had more authority than he did. Hale watched the exchange without interruption, allowing the realization to unfold on its own, because forcing it would only weaken its impact. Daniel swallowed, his grip on the radio loosening slightly, as the device that had always connected him to power now felt like proof that he had lost it. Ava's eyes did not leave his, and in that steady gaze there was no anger, no satisfaction, only truth, and it was that absence of emotion that made it impossible to dismiss, because this was not about winning or losing. This was about understanding, and Daniel was only just beginning to realize how much he had misunderstood. The lights above them steadied fully now, the system no longer flickering, no longer uncertain. Everything had settled into a new order, one that had existed long before he stepped into this hallway, and one that no longer needed his permission to operate. Daniel Brooks stood there with the weight of realization pressing down on him, but instinct did not disappear so easily. It resisted, it searched for something familiar to hold on to, and even as the pieces began to shift around him, there was still a part of him that refused to accept that he had misjudged the situation so completely. His grip tightened again slightly around the radio, not because it still worked, but because it represented something he was not ready to let go of. Authority did not vanish in a single moment. At least that was what he had always believed. "You are telling me the system chose to ignore me," he said, his voice measured but strained beneath the surface. Ava Carter did not respond immediately. She let the silence sit between them, not as avoidance, but as space, as if the answer needed time to settle before it could be understood. Marcus Hale watched carefully, his posture unchanged, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because this was not about forcing compliance. This was about forcing awareness. Ava finally spoke, her tone calm and steady. "The system did not ignore you, officer, recognized you." And that distinction landed deeper than Daniel expected. His brow tightened as he tried to process the meaning. "Recognize me," he repeated, and for the first time there was something in his voice that resembled uncertainty without resistance. Ava nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as confirmation of what he was beginning to see. "You made a decision the moment you saw me," she continued. "You decided I did not belong here, and everything you did after that came from that decision." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out at first, because there was truth in what she said, truth he could not easily dismiss. He shifted his stance again, the movement subtle but revealing. "I followed procedure," he said finally, but this time the statement lacked the strength it had carried before. It sounded less like certainty and more like defense. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Procedure is only as reliable as the judgment behind it," she replied, and in that sentence there was no accusation, only clarity. Hale stepped slightly forward now, not to take over, but to reinforce what had already been said. "Officer Brooks," he added, "you're trained to assess situations, not just react to them. And today your assessment was influenced by something other than facts." Daniel's jaw tightened again, because now the conversation had moved beyond authority and into something more personal, something harder to deflect. He glanced briefly at the employees still watching, aware now that every word spoken here carried weight beyond the moment, and that awareness only increased the pressure building in his chest. "I did not do anything wrong," he said, but even as he spoke, the certainty was no longer there. It lingered as a habit rather than a conviction. Ava took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel more direct, more grounded. "You did not ask who I was," she said quietly. "You decided who I was." Daniel felt that line settle into him with a kind of quiet force that was harder to push back against than any command, because it was not about rules or systems anymore. It was about perception, about the moment before action, the moment he had always believed he controlled. The overhead lights remained steady now, the corridor no longer shifting or flickering. Everything had stabilized, but the stability did not bring comfort. It brought clarity, and clarity made it harder to ignore what was unfolding. The radio in Daniel's hand crackled softly again, not with urgency, but with presence, a low signal that confirmed the system was active, just not for him. Hale glanced briefly at the device, then back at Daniel. "The override is still in place," he said, "and it will remain until this situation is fully resolved." Daniel looked down at the radio for a moment, then slowly lowered it to his side. The motion small, but significant because it marked the first time he had stopped trying to regain control through it. He looked back up at Ava, really looking now, not through assumption, not through expectation, but through the lens of everything that had just been revealed. And what he saw was not someone out of place, but someone who had never been out of place at all, just someone he had failed to recognize. Ava's gaze remained steady, and in that steadiness there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the quiet presence of truth. And that truth had already begun to change the outcome of everything that followed. The corridors settled into a silence that no longer felt temporary. It felt intentional, like every sound that used to fill the space had been pulled back to make room for something else, something heavier, something that demanded attention without raising its voice. Daniel Brooks stood still, the radio now resting at his side, no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of what had already shifted beyond his reach. And for the first time since this began, he did not immediately speak. He did not reach for procedure. He did not try to correct the situation. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of everything that had been revealed. Ava Carter watched him without pressure, without expectation, allowing the silence to do what words no longer could. Because sometimes understanding did not come from being told. It came from being left alone with the truth. Marcus Hale remained just behind her, his presence steady, observant, ensuring that nothing disrupted the moment that was unfolding, because this was the point where everything either changed or stayed the same, and that choice no longer belonged to the system. It belonged to Daniel. A faint sound echoed from deeper in the building, not an alarm, not a warning, just a low operational hum that suggested the system had completed whatever sequence it had initiated. And that completion carried its own kind of finality. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal something internal had begun to give way. He looked at Ava again, but this time there was no challenge in his eyes, no assumption, only a quiet attempt to understand what he had failed to see before. "You could have said something," he muttered, the words not sharp, not defensive, but searching, almost as if he needed there to have been another option. Another path that would have prevented this moment from happening. Ava's expression did not change, but her response came with the same calm clarity she had held from the beginning. "I did," she said. "I asked if you were sure." Daniel exhaled slowly, the memory of that moment replaying in his mind, the exact point where he had dismissed her, where he had chosen certainty over question. And now that moment felt different, Heavier, like a line he had crossed without realizing it. He ran his tongue briefly along the inside of his cheek, a small gesture that revealed more tension than any raised voice could have. I did not think it mattered, he admitted, and the honesty in that statement carried more weight than any argument he could have made. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because that was the truth of it. It mattered before you decided it did not, she replied, and there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet reflection of what had already happened. Hale watched the exchange carefully, noting the shift not just in Daniel's words, but in his posture, the way his stance had changed from confrontation to reflection. And that shift was what this moment had been building toward, not punishment, not force, but recognition. Daniel glanced briefly down the corridor, aware now of the people who had witnessed everything. And for the first time, he did not see them as background or interruption. He saw them as part of the outcome, as people who had seen what he had done and what he had become in that moment. And that awareness settled deeper than anything Hale could have said. He looked back at Ava, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority he had leaned on before. What happens now, he asked. And it was not a challenge, it was a genuine question. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then let her eyes shift briefly toward Hale. Not for permission, but for alignment, because what came next was not about her alone. It was about the system he had trusted and the way it responded when that trust was misplaced. Hale stepped forward just enough to be clearly present again, his voice calm, controlled. We document. He said, we review, and we correct. Daniel nodded slowly, the words simple but heavy with implication, because he understood what they meant, not just in terms of procedure, but in terms of consequence. Ava looked back at him one last time in that moment, and in her expression there was still no anger, no satisfaction, only the quiet presence of someone who had not needed to raise her voice to be heard. And that was the part that stayed with him the most, because in a place where authority was usually loud, hers had been silent, and it had still changed everything. The weight of what had just been said did not disappear when the words ended. It lingered in the corridor, settling into every corner, into every quiet glance from the people who had witnessed the moment unfold. Daniel Brooks stood there with his shoulders slightly lowered, the edge that had once defined his presence now replaced by something more uncertain, more aware, and yet the situation was not finished. It had only shifted into something deeper, something that required more than just acknowledgement. Marcus Hale took a slow breath, then reached into the inside of his jacket once more, this time removing the thin folder he had held earlier and opening it with deliberate care. The sound of paper moving against paper seemed louder than it should have in the silence, because now every detail mattered. Officer Brooks, Hale said, his tone even, we're going to walk through what happened here, step by step, not for accusation, but for record. Daniel nodded once, the motion small, but significant, because he understood now that this was no longer a conversation he could control or redirect. It was a process, and that process had already begun before he realized it. Hale glanced briefly toward Ava, then back to the open folder, confirming alignment without words. Time of initial contact, he began, his voice steady. Daniel inhaled slowly, replaying the moment in his mind. Approximately 9:23 in the morning, he said, the time coming back to him with clarity, because moments like that were always recorded in his memory. Hale nodded slightly, continuing, you approached Miss Carter and issued a directive to leave the restricted floor. Correct. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, yes. Hale's pen moved smoothly across the page, not rushing, not pausing unnecessarily. And at that point, did you request identification before issuing that directive? The question was simple, but it carried weight. Daniel felt it immediately. He shifted his stance slightly, his eyes dropping for just a moment before returning to Hale. No, he admitted, the word quiet but clear, and in that single admission, the foundation of everything that had followed became visible. Hale did not react. He simply noted it, then continued. Did Miss Carter present any behavior that indicated a security threat? Daniel shook his head slightly. No, she did not. Hale wrote again, his movements consistent, controlled. And then he paused, looking up at Daniel directly. Did you base your decision on verified information or on your immediate assessment? The corridor seemed to grow quieter at that question, As if even the building itself was waiting for the answer, Daniel swallowed, because now the truth was no longer something he could avoid or reshape. It was something he had to face directly. "It was my assessment," he said, and the words felt heavier than anything he had spoken before. Hale closed the folder halfway. Not fully, just enough to signal a transition. And in that moment, the process shifted from recording to understanding. "Your assessment was influenced by perception," Hale said. "Not accusation, not judgment, simply fact." Daniel did not respond immediately because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. Ava stood quietly beside them, her presence unchanged, but now it carried a different meaning. She was no longer the subject of the situation. She was the center of it, the reference point that everything else was measured against. Hale turned slightly toward her, a subtle acknowledgement of that reality, then back to Daniel. "The system responded to your actions based on that assessment," he continued, "and when that assessment was incorrect, the system corrected it." Daniel let out a slow breath, the explanation settling into him with a clarity that left no room for denial. He looked down briefly, then back up, his voice quieter now. "I understand," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no resistance, just acceptance of what had already been set in motion. Hale nodded once, closing the folder completely now, the sound final but not harsh. "Understanding is the first step," he said. "The next is what you do with it." Daniel met his gaze. And for the first time since this began, there was no attempt to reclaim authority, no attempt to push back, only a quiet readiness to face whatever came next. And in that moment, the corridor did not feel like a place of conflict anymore. It felt like a place where something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen, and something that would shape everything that followed. The corridor no longer felt like a place where anything could be hidden. Every word that had been spoken seemed to remain in the air, shaping the silence that followed. Daniel Brooks stood still, absorbing what had just been recorded, what had just been acknowledged. And for a moment it seemed as if everything had reached its conclusion, as if the situation had already resolved itself into understanding. Marcus Hale had closed the folder. Ava Carter remained calm and unmoving, and the system had stabilized around them. No more flickering lights, no more shifting signals, just a steady, controlled environment that reflected order restored. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly as the tension that had driven his actions began to loosen its grip. "I understand what happened," he said quietly, almost to himself, and there was a sense, brief but real, that perhaps that was enough. That recognition alone might close the distance between what he had done and what needed to follow. Hale watched him carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing the moment to settle fully, because false closure often came disguised as understanding, and this was where many situations ended too soon. Daniel shifted his weight again, looking down the corridor, noticing the employees who had returned to stillness, their attention no longer as sharp, their movements beginning to resume. As if the visible tension had passed, he looked back at Ava, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I made a call based on what I saw," he said, "and I was wrong." The admission came more easily now, almost as if speaking it aloud gave him a sense of resolution. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her stillness that suggested the moment was not complete. "Not yet." Daniel nodded once, a small gesture that felt like closure to him. "I will document it," he added, "and I will make sure it does not happen again." For a second, it felt like that should be the end of it. The correction acknowledged, the lesson learned, the system satisfied, but the silence that followed did not confirm that feeling. It challenged it, because nothing in Ava's posture shifted, nothing in Hale's stance suggested finality, and that absence of closure lingered, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's brow tightened slightly, sensing it now, sensing that something remained unresolved. "Is there anything else?" he asked, the question cautious, as if unsure whether he wanted to hear the answer. Hale did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention toward Ava, a silent indication that what came next was not his to deliver. Ava stepped forward again, just enough to hold Daniel's full attention, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a different weight. "You're focusing on what happened," she said, "and not on why it happened." Daniel's expression shifted slightly. confusion returning, because in his mind the answer was already clear. I made a wrong judgment, he replied. But even as he spoke, the words felt incomplete. Ava shook her head once, not dismissing him, but guiding him further. No, she said quietly, you made a fast judgment, and you trusted it without question. The distinction was small, but it changed everything. Daniel felt it immediately, because it moved the focus away from the outcome and onto the instinct that had driven it. Hale remained silent, allowing the weight of that realization to settle on its own. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, his voice softer now. And what does that change? He asked. Ava's eyes held. His steady and unwavering. It changes whether this was a mistake or a pattern, she said, and that single word hung in the air longer than anything else that had been spoken. Pattern, not an isolated moment, not a single misstep, but something that repeated, something that shaped decisions before they were even made. Daniel felt the impact of that word more deeply than anything that had come before, because it reached beyond this hallway, beyond this moment, into every decision that had led him here. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped because there was no immediate answer, no quick defense, only the quiet realization that understanding what happened was not the same as understanding why it kept happening. And as that realization settled in, the corridor did not feel resolved anymore. It felt like the beginning of something far more difficult to face. The word pattern did not fade when Ava spoke it. It lingered in Daniel Brooks's mind, echoing louder than any command that had come through his radio, because it was not a technical failure he could explain away or a procedural error he could correct with training. It was something deeper, something that had shaped his decisions long before this moment. And for the first time, he did not try to respond immediately. He did not reach for justification or explanation. He simply stood there, letting the weight of that realization settle into him. Marcus Hale watched closely, recognizing the shift, because this was the point where acknowledgement either turned into change or hardened into denial. And the difference between those two outcomes would define everything that followed. Daniel finally looked up, his voice quieter, stripped of the certainty that had once driven it. You're saying this was not just about today, he said, and the question carried more weight than any statement he had made before. Ava Carter held his gaze, her expression steady. You stopped asking questions the moment you felt certain, she replied, and when certainty comes too fast, it is rarely based on truth. Daniel felt that sentence land in a place he had not expected, because it did not accuse him of intent. It revealed something about process, about the way decisions formed before evidence had a chance to exist. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, because now the situation was no longer something happening around him. It was something happening within him. Hale stepped slightly forward, his presence reinforcing the transition from confrontation to consequence. Officer Brooks, he said calmly, this is not the first time your name has appeared in a report involving premature judgment. Daniel's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in defiance, but in recognition, because he knew what Hale was referring to even before the details were spoken. Minor complaints, notes that had never escalated, moments that had been dismissed as isolated, each one small enough to ignore, but together forming something larger, something he had never been forced to confront until now. Those were resolved, Daniel said, his voice low, almost reflexive. Hale nodded once, acknowledging the statement without dismissing it. They were closed, he said, not corrected. The distinction was quiet but undeniable, and it shifted the ground beneath Daniel once again. Ava remained still, allowing Hale to carry the procedural weight of what came next, because this was not about personal confrontation anymore. It was about systemic response. Hale opened the folder again, flipping to a different section, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise. There's a difference between an incident and a pattern, he continued, and patterns require a different kind of response. Daniel felt the corridor close in around him, slightly, not physically, but in the way his options seemed to narrow, the way the path forward was no longer something he could choose freely. What kind of response, he asked, and the question was no longer defensive. It was direct, because he understood now that avoiding the answer would not change it. Hale met his gaze, his voice steady. Review, retraining, and possible suspension pending full evaluation. The words were not delivered with force, but they carried the weight of inevitability. Daniel nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he understood, because there was nothing left to argue against. Ava stepped forward just slightly, her presence returning to the center of the moment, but her voice remained calm, controlled. "You were not stopped to punish you," she said. "You were stopped to prevent this from continuing." Daniel looked at her, and for the first time there was no trace of resistance in his expression, only a quiet recognition of what she meant. Because this was no longer about authority being challenged. It was about authority being corrected. The radio at his side gave a soft signal again, not for him, but around him, confirming that the system was active, functioning, and aligned with something beyond his reach. Daniel lowered his head slightly, then lifted it again, meeting Hale's eyes. "What happens next?" he asked. Hale closed the folder once more, his movements deliberate. "We move forward," he said, "and how you move forward will determine whether this ends here or becomes something more." The corridor remained still, but the stillness no longer felt uncertain. It felt defined, as if the outcome had already begun to take shape, and Daniel Brooks stood in the center of it, no longer the one in control, but the one being given a choice about what came next. Daniel Brooks stood in the center of the corridor as the weight of the decision ahead settled into something real, something unavoidable. And for the first time since this began, the silence around him did not feel like pressure. It felt like expectation. Marcus Hale had made it clear that the process would move forward, that consequences were no longer a possibility, but a certainty. And yet within that certainty, there was still something left for Daniel to choose, something that would define not just what happened next, but who he would be when this moment was over. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, not to regain control, but to face what had already been set in motion. "I will cooperate," he said finally, his voice calm, direct, and without resistance. Hale studied him for a moment, measuring not just the words, but the intention behind them, because compliance could be surface level. It could be temporary, but what mattered here was whether it reached deeper than that, whether it signaled a shift that would last beyond this hallway. "We will begin with a formal review," Hale replied, his tone consistent. "You will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending evaluation." Daniel nodded once, accepting the terms without argument, because he understood now that this was not about negotiation. It was about accountability. Ava Carter watched the exchange quietly, her presence still grounded, still steady. But now there was something else in the air, something that had not been there at the beginning. Not tension, not conflict, but resolution beginning to take shape. Daniel turned his attention to her, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he was searching for the right words, something that could acknowledge what had happened without diminishing it. "I should have asked," he said, the sentence simple, but carrying more weight than anything he had said before. Ava held his gaze, and for the first time there was a subtle shift in her expression, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition of the effort it took to say that out loud. "Yes," she replied quietly. "You should have." And that was all she said, because the moment did not need more than that. Hale stepped slightly to the side, allowing space for the final part of the process to unfold. "You will report to the administrative office on the ground level," he instructed. "Your access to this floor is revoked until further notice." Daniel glanced briefly at the badge clipped to his uniform, the symbol that had once defined his place here, and for a moment he hesitated. Not because he intended to resist, but because letting go of it felt like acknowledging the full weight of what had changed. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unclipped it, holding in his hand for a second before lowering it to his side. The action quiet but final. One of the employees down the corridor shifted slightly, watching the moment with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. Because what had happened here was no longer just an incident, it was a visible correction, something that would be remembered. Daniel looked back at Hale, then at Ava, his voice steady. "I understand," he said again, but this time the words carried something different, not just acknowledgement, but acceptance. Hale gave a small nod, then stepped back toward the elevator, signaling that the immediate process was complete. Ava remained where she was, her presence unchanged. But now it no longer felt like something that needed to be questioned or challenged. It felt established, undeniable. Daniel took a step back, then another, creating space where there had once been confrontation. And as he turned to walk down the corridor, away from the restricted floor he had tried to control, the sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the walls, steady, measured, different from the way he had arrived. Behind him, the elevator doors remained open for a moment longer, then closed with a quiet finality. And the system that had gone silent earlier now remained active, but not for him. Because authority had not disappeared. It had simply shifted back to where it had always belonged. And as Daniel Brooks walked away, he carried with him not just the consequence of his actions, but the understanding of why they had happened. And that understanding would follow him far beyond this hallway. The sound of Daniel Brooks's footsteps faded slowly down the corridor, each step carrying the weight of a realization that would not leave him easily. And as he disappeared beyond the corner, the space he left behind did not return to what it had been before, because something had changed, not just in him, but in the system that had quietly corrected itself in real time. Marcus Hale remained standing for a moment, his eyes following the direction Daniel had gone, not out of concern, but out of acknowledgement, because what had just happened was not the end of a process. It was the beginning of one that would continue far beyond this floor. He then turned his attention back to Ava Carter, his posture shifting slightly, less formal now, but still grounded in respect. "Everything is in motion," he said calmly. "The review will begin immediately." Ava nodded once, her expression unchanged because none of this surprised her. None of it required reaction. It was simply the system functioning as it was designed to when it was allowed to operate without interference. "Good," she replied quietly, her voice steady. Then her gaze moved briefly toward the corridor where Daniel had disappeared, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with something more measured, something that recognized the weight of what he would now have to face. Hale followed her glance for a brief second, then returned his focus to her. "You handled that without escalation," he said, and there was a subtle note in his voice, not praise, but acknowledgement of discipline. Ava's lips pressed together slightly, not in a smile, but in quiet reflection. "Escalation was not necessary," she said. "When the system is allowed to respond, the answer came simply, but it carried a depth that reached beyond the moment, because it was not about this one interaction. It was about a pattern that had been interrupted without force, without confrontation, without noise, the kind of correction that left no room for denial." Hale nodded once, understanding exactly what she meant. The strength of authority did not come from how loud it was, but from how precisely it acted. The employees who had witnessed everything began to move again now, slowly at first, then with more confidence, their voices returning in low conversations, not about gossip, but about what they had just seen, because moments like this did not go unnoticed. They reshaped perception. They reminded everyone watching that authority was not always visible, and that assumptions carried consequences. Ava turned slightly, her attention shifting away from the corridor and back to the work that had brought her there in the first place, because for her, this had never been the main event. It had been an interruption, a necessary one, but still an interruption. "We still have a review to complete," she said, her tone returning to the quiet focus it had held before everything unfolded. Hale closed the folder in his hands and adjusted his stance. "Ready to continue, of course," he replied, stepping slightly to the side as if resetting the space to its intended purpose. Ava walked past him toward the secure door at the end of the corridor, the one Daniel had tried to keep her from reaching. And as she approached, the system responded immediately. The access panel beside the door lit up without her touching it, a soft confirmation tone sounding as the lock disengaged, the door opening with smooth precision. Not because she forced it, not because she requested it, but because it recognized her presence without question. Hale watched for a moment, not out of surprise, but out of quiet respect for the consistency of the system. When it functioned correctly, Ava paused briefly at the threshold, then stepped through without hesitation, her movement steady, unchallenged, the door closing behind her with a soft, final sound that echoed lightly in the corridor. Hale remained outside for a moment longer, then turned and followed, the space returning to its normal rhythm, but not its previous state, because everyone who had witnessed what happened would carry that moment with them, not as a story of conflict, but as a reminder that authority does not always announce itself, and that the truth of who belongs is not decided by who speaks the loudest, but by who the system listens to when everything else falls silent. The building returned to its quiet rhythm. But for Daniel Brooks, nothing felt the same as he stepped into the administrative office on the ground level. The fluorescent lights above him humming softly. The air cooler, more controlled, less forgiving. He stood at the reception desk with his badge resting in his hand. No longer clipped to his uniform, no longer a symbol of unquestioned authority, but something that now carried a different weight, a woman behind the desk. Looked up, her expression professional, neutral, but her eyes briefly flicked to the badge in his hand, then back to his face, as if she already knew why he was there. Administrative review, he said, his voice steady, but quieter than it had been earlier that morning. She nodded once, typing something into her computer, then gestured toward a seating area. Someone will be with you shortly. Daniel stepped away from the desk and sat down, the chair firm beneath him, the room silent except for the faint sound of keys tapping and distant footsteps echoing through the hall. And for the first time since everything unfolded, he was alone with his thoughts. No corridor, no audience, no system responding in real time. Just the memory of what had happened and the realization of what it meant. He looked down at the badge in his hand, turning it slightly, watching the light reflect off its surface, thinking about how easily he had relied on it, how quickly he had used it to define who belonged and who did not. And now it felt different, not meaningless, but incomplete, because it had never been the source of authority he believed it was. It had only been a part of something larger, something he had failed to respect. The door across the room opened, and a senior officer stepped inside, his presence calm but firm. "Officer Brooks," he said, motioning for Daniel to follow. Daniel stood, slipping the badge into his pocket, and walked into the office without hesitation. The conversation that followed was not loud, not dramatic, but clear. A formal review would begin. His record would be examined. His actions would be evaluated not just for what he did, but for why he did it. And the outcome would determine his future within the department. There was no anger in the room, no raised voices, only process, only accountability. And Daniel listened, answering when asked, not resisting, not deflecting, because he understood now that this was not something he could talk his way out of. It was something he had to face. Hours later, as he stepped out of the building, the sunlight felt different, brighter, but not comforting. The city moved around him as it always had. People walking, cars passing, life continuing without pause. And yet for him, everything had shifted, not in the world, but in how. He saw it. He stood there for a moment, taking a slow breath, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The moment he made the decision, the moment the radio went silent, the moment he realized he was wrong. And for the first time, he did not try to justify any of it. He simply accepted it. Across the street, a group of people passed by, their conversations blending into the noise of the city. And Daniel watched them differently now, not as figures to assess or categorize, but as individuals. He did not yet understand. And that difference, small as it seemed, was where everything began to change. Back inside the building, far above the ground floor, Ava Carter stood in a secured office reviewing documents, her focus steady, her work continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Because for her, this was not about a single moment. It was about ensuring that the system functioned as it should, that it corrected itself when necessary, that it protected truth over assumption. Marcus. Hale stepped into the room quietly, placing a finalized report on the desk. "It is done," he said. Ava glanced at the document, then nodded once, her expression calm. Not satisfied, not relieved, simply aligned with the outcome, because justice had not come through force or anger or confrontation. It had come through recognition, through correction, through the system doing exactly what it was meant to do when it was allowed to. And somewhere below, Daniel Brooks walked forward into a future that would now be shaped not by the authority he thought he had, but by the understanding he had gained, because that day he did not just lose control of a situation. He learned what control was supposed to mean, and in the quiet echo of everything that had happened, one truth remained. He thought he was enforcing the rules, but that day, the rules showed him who they were written for.